June 6, 1944. At 5:30 in the morning, the greatest invasion in human history was about to begin. 160,000 American, British, and Canadian soldiers were preparing to land on the beaches of Normandy in France, while thousands of ships filled the English Channel and hundreds of bombers roared overhead as Operation Overlord, the D-Day invasion that would liberate Western Europe from Nazi occupation, moved into action. At that same moment, another, completely different reality existed in the minds of German commanders, from Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt at Fontainebleau to officers all along the Channel coast, and above all in the mind of Adolf Hitler. In that reality, 22 German divisions, nearly 350,000 soldiers, were waiting in the Pas-de-Calais region for what they believed would be the true, decisive Allied invasion that had not yet begun. Those divisions had been ordered not to move and not to reinforce Normandy because the German High Command felt certain the landings there were only a diversion. Their confidence came from what appeared to be impeccable sources: trusted agents, detailed radio traffic, and aerial photographs, all reinforcing the image of a huge Allied army assembling opposite Pas-de-Calais. That army, the 1st United States Army Group, or FUSAG, existed only on paper, in radio waves, and in the intelligence summaries of the German command. At the heart of this illusion stood a Spanish farmer who had never set foot in Britain, an American general the Germans feared more than any other, and a secret unit of artists and sound engineers armed with rubber tanks and recordings of fake battles. The story of Operation Fortitude is therefore not just a tale of clever tricks, but of how a carefully built lie, supported by just enough visible evidence, can overpower reality in the mind of an enemy commander. It is also a story of how understanding the psychology, prejudices, and expectations of an opponent can sometimes be more powerful than any number of guns or tanks. At its deepest level, this deception reveals something uncomfortable and fascinating about modern war: that victory can depend not only on what happens on the battlefield, but on what one side can make the other side believe is happening. In the summer of 1944, the Allies did not just land on the beaches of Normandy, they also landed inside the imagination of the German command and rearranged what it thought was real. The most unlikely architect of this mental invasion was Juan Pujol Garcia, born in 1912 in Spain and with no formal background in war or espionage. He was a shy, modest man who had failed at several careers, yet he became one of the most important double agents of the Second World War. Pujol did not have the profile of a glamorous secret agent. He was not a polished diplomat, a famous soldier, or a man of great education. What he did possess was a burning determination to fight Nazism in his own way and an extraordinary imagination that allowed him to construct a world of believable fiction. In 1941, he approached the German consulate in Barcelona and offered his services as a spy who could travel to Britain and report on Allied activity. The Germans were initially unimpressed by this ordinary Spaniard and refused to recruit him as an agent, but their rejection did not end his ambition. Instead, Pujol decided on an audacious course of action. He would pretend to work for the Germans while secretly seeking out the British, and in the meantime, he would improvise. He obtained a forged diplomatic-style passport, claimed to be traveling to London on official business, and convinced German intelligence that he was about to begin espionage inside Britain. In reality, he never reached London at all, and instead settled in Lisbon in neutral Portugal, operating from a modest apartment in the seaside suburb of Estoril. From there, he began sending the Germans detailed reports supposedly coming from inside Britain, building from nothing one of the most elaborate imaginary spy networks in history. The raw material for his intelligence work was not top-secret documents, but public information that any tourist or businessman could acquire. He devoured British guidebooks, railway timetables, newspapers, illustrated magazines, and even advertisements, extracting from them the details he needed to make his reports sound like the observations of real agents spread across the country. What made his reports uniquely convincing was the level of concrete detail he included about places, units, and routines. Instead of saying simply that troops were moving, he would describe a specific regiment leaving a named town at a precise hour, complete with the apparent number of men, vehicles, and even small mishaps along the way. Pujol understood instinctively that intelligence officers trust reports that contain the kind of tiny, vivid details that seem too awkward to invent. By filling his messages with minor inconveniences, personal complaints, and plausible logistical issues, he made his imaginary network feel alive and fallible in exactly the way real human sources are. Over time, he populated this fictional network with 27 agents, each with a defined personality, job, and location. There was a supposed volunteer in the Royal Air Force, a Ministry of War clerk with access to deployment plans, a dock worker in Liverpool watching ship movements, a pious priest hearing the confessions of soldiers, and several women working in administrative posts. For each of these invisible people, he wrote long backstories full of personal problems, family ties, and financial needs, which made their reports feel all the more credible. In doing so, he not only fooled the Germans, but over time, even some British handlers were astonished by the richness of this fictional world that existed only on paper and in radio traffic. Of course, no deception on this scale can be completely free of mistakes, and one of Pujol's errors has become famous as a darkly comic episode. In one report, he described a supposed agent in Glasgow who, according to him, would do anything for a liter of wine. A small detail meant to make the character feel charmingly human. This little flourish, however, revealed two things that any real Briton would have known instinctively at the time. First, Britain had not yet adopted the metric system in everyday life, so people spoke in pints and quarts rather than liters. Second, Glaswegians were famed for their taste for whiskey and beer, not for wine, making the preference seem culturally odd. British counterintelligence, which was reading German traffic thanks to code breaking, noticed this oddity and launched a search for the supposed agent in Glasgow. After an exhaustive hunt turned up no such person, they decided he must be either incredibly careful or already arrested, never suspecting that he had never existed in the first place. Ironically, instead of undermining Pujol's credibility, the failure to find this fictional wine-loving Scot actually reinforced German belief in his reports. Intelligence services that already trust a source tend to interpret anomalies as signs of their own investigative limitations, rather than as evidence that the source is fabricating information. By late 1943, German case officers had come to regard Pujol, whom they codenamed Arabelle, as one of their most valuable assets in Britain. They were so impressed that they promoted him, increased his funding, and relied heavily on his ever-growing network of imaginary sub-agents to understand Allied preparations. Around the same time, British intelligence, running him as a controlled double agent under the codename Garbo, realized that his position made him the perfect vehicle for a large-scale strategic deception. If his fictional network began to report on an enormous, detailed phantom army, there was every chance the Germans would accept it as real. That phantom army was the 1st United States Army Group, or FUSAG, a formation that became the centerpiece of Operation Fortitude. On Allied maps, in forged documents, and above all in carefully constructed intelligence leaks, FUSAG appeared to be a massive invasion force assembling in southeastern England opposite Pas-de-Calais. According to the notional order of battle that the Allies fed to German intelligence, FUSAG included an American 14th Army with several corps and divisions, and was supported by a British 4th Army and a 1st Canadian Army. Many of the divisions were either completely fictitious or real units temporarily assigned to FUSAG, only on paper to give the illusion of overwhelming strength. This phantom force was presented as larger and more powerful than General Bernard Montgomery's very real 21st Army Group, which in reality would carry out the Normandy landings. To German analysts looking at reports, maps, and radio traffic, FUSAG looked unmistakably like the main Allied striking force. Adding to this conviction was the choice of commander for the fictitious army, which was as brilliant psychologically as it was simple. The Allies placed General George Smith Patton, Jr. in nominal command of FUSAG, and in doing so, they weaponized the German army's own respect and fear for this aggressive American commander. Patton had earned a fierce reputation in the North African and Sicilian campaigns as a hard-driving, fast-moving leader who embodied offensive warfare. German officers like Heinz Guderian later admitted that among all Allied generals, Patton was the one they considered most dangerous, both for his speed and his willingness to take risks. Yet in late 1943, Patton's career seemed to have stalled after he slapped an American soldier suffering from combat stress in Sicily, a scandal that ignited outrage in the United States. General Dwight Eisenhower removed him from frontline command and sent him to England, officially to take charge of the new army group forming opposite Pas-de-Calais. This apparent demotion was, in fact, a masterstroke of deception, because it gave the Germans exactly the narrative they expected. From their point of view, the Allies would not squander their most aggressive general on a diversion, so the mere fact that Patton's name was attached to FUSAG signaled that it must be the main invasion force. Even after D-Day, when Patton secretly moved to France to command the real American Third Army, German intelligence continued to receive reports placing him in England. For weeks he existed in two places at once, commanding a real army in battle while still appearing to lead the phantom FUSAG preparing for an invasion that would never come. If FUSAG was the phantom muscle of Operation Fortitude, the inflatable tanks were its phantom bones and skin. The Allies needed the German Air Force and photo interpreters to see what they already expected to see in southeastern England: fields packed with armor, artillery, trucks, and support vehicles poised for a cross-channel assault. The problem was that the real tanks and vehicles were required elsewhere, mainly for the actual Normandy invasion, and could not be spared to simply sit as decoys. American industry therefore turned to a new solution by asking rubber and textile companies to build full-scale inflatable versions of major weapons systems. Companies like United States, Rubber, Goodyear, and the Scranton Lace Company, which had once woven delicate lace for wedding dresses and curtains, began producing rubberized fabric shells. When inflated, these shells became convincing three-dimensional replicas of M4 Sherman tanks, artillery pieces, trucks, and even aircraft. Each inflatable tank weighed only a few hundred pounds and could be carried by 4 soldiers who could deploy and inflate it in roughly half an hour using small air compressors. Painted in authentic camouflage colors and shaped to match the outline of real vehicles, they were nearly indistinguishable from real tanks in photographs taken from high altitude. The workers who manufactured these strange artifacts, many of them women who had moved into factory jobs during the war, often had no idea what they were making beyond the vague phrase, war material. Only after the war did some receive letters explaining that the rubber and canvas shapes they had stitched together had helped to fool the German high command and save lives on the beaches of Normandy. Once in the field, these inflatable machines were arranged in parks, assembly areas, and mock encampments across Kent and other counties facing France. At night, soldiers would reposition them and even drag chains or special rigs to create tracks in the soil, so that every new German reconnaissance photograph showed apparent movement and buildup of armor. The success of this visual deception rested on more than just physical resemblance. It exploited the limitations and biases of the enemy's observation apparatus. German pilots flying at tens of thousands of feet had seconds to photograph and visually scan the ground, while analysts were predisposed to mark anything tank-shaped in the expected area as genuine armor. Crucially, Allied intelligence was reading German assessments of these photographs through ultra-code breaking, which turned the deception into a feedback loop. When reports from the German side mentioned hundreds of tanks in areas where only inflatable decoys existed, Allied planners knew their illusion was working and could reinforce it further. The inflatable tanks and fake motor pools were only one part of a larger theatrical production that required specialists in camouflage, art, and sound. That production was carried out by a uniquely creative American unit, the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops, better known as the Ghost Army. Activated in January of 1944, the Ghost Army brought together approximately 1,100 soldiers, including 82 officers and over 1,000 enlisted men. Among them were painters, sculptors, architects, set designers, sound technicians, illustrators, and fashion designers, all recruited for their ability to create convincing illusions. One of the most famous members was Bill Blass, a young New York fashion designer who had joined the Army and found himself serving not in a rifle company, but in a deception unit. Fellow soldiers later recalled the surreal sight of Blass in a foxhole in Europe, reading Vogue magazine and sketching dress designs in the pauses between missions to deploy inflatable tanks. Another future luminary was Ellsworth Kelly, who would later become a leading abstract artist with works displayed in the Museum of Modern Art and major galleries worldwide. During the war, he used his artistic eye to help design camouflage, layouts for fake encampments, and painted details to make decoy equipment look authentic under aerial scrutiny. The Ghost Army operated in several disciplines at once: visual deception with inflatable equipment, sonic deception using powerful loudspeakers, and radio deception through carefully scripted transmissions. Together, these three strands could make a small group of men appear, from the enemy's perspective, to be an entire division or corps. The unit's sonic troops possessed trucks fitted with enormous speakers and specially prepared recordings of engines, artillery, and troop movements. Engineers had captured these sounds from real units and could mix them into tailored soundscapes that mimicked the noise of specific forces moving, idling, or assembling at night. On deployment, the sound trucks would park in concealed spots near the front, while inflatable tanks and fake vehicles were set up nearby. After dark, the operators would play hours of carefully chosen audio at high volume, sending the echoing rumble of movement across the fields to any German listeners beyond the lines. To a nervous enemy patrol or an intelligence listener, these nighttime soundscapes suggested that tanks and vehicles were arriving in large numbers. Paired with visual sightings, even if fleeting, and perhaps reports from scouts or intercepted radio traffic, the result was a convincing picture of a major force assembling. The radio side of the Ghost Army's work overlapped with a broader British-run deception known as Operation Quicksilver, headquartered in the tunnels beneath Dover Castle. There, teams of British and Canadian operators spent long shifts sending and receiving messages that appeared to be routine communication within FUSAG and its subordinate units. These radio operators had to master not only codes and procedures, but the daily rhythm of military life, from supply requests and maintenance reports to training schedules and personnel rotations. Their traffic was intentionally dull, because real command networks spend far more time discussing fuel, food, and spare parts than daring secret plans. The content of the messages included mundane but specific details, such as requests for thousands of gallons of fuel or tens of thousands of rounds of ammunition, and notes on engine breakdowns or upcoming field exercises. To German signals intelligence, these exchanges sounded exactly like the background chatter of a very large army preparing for battle. A similar pattern played out in Scotland, where radio traffic for the fictitious British Fourth Army was filled with references to crampons, ice axes, skis, cold weather lubricants, and instructions for operating engines at sub-zero temperatures. This created the strong impression that a substantial Allied force was rehearsing and equipping for operations in Norway's harsh climate. German analysts, already aware that Norway's coastline was vulnerable and strategically important, took this northern threat seriously. They concluded that the Allies might well mount a secondary or even primary invasion there, and in response, they kept several divisions stationed in Norway that might otherwise have been redeployed to France. By early June of 1944, the cumulative effect of all these efforts, Garbo's reports, Ghost Army theatrics, fake radio traffic, and carefully planted documents, had crystallized into a firm German estimate of Allied strength and intentions. That estimate was impressively detailed, but it was wrong in exactly the ways the Allies needed. German intelligence believed the Western Allies possessed close to 89 divisions ready for operations in Britain and the Mediterranean, when in fact the real number was under 50. They thought FUSAG alone contained nearly 50 divisions and over 1 million men, making it more powerful on paper than Montgomery's entire 21st Army Group. They also estimated that the first assault wave of an invasion could include as many as 20 divisions landing across a wide front, whereas the actual D-Day landings would involve roughly 5 assault divisions on the first day. Their numbers represented an overestimation of Allied strength by factors ranging from half again as many troops to several times the real number. Just as importantly, their mental map of where those forces would strike was skewed by the deception. They ranked Pas-de-Calais as the most probable invasion site, with Normandy considered a plausible but secondary option, while threats to Norway and the southern French coast were regarded as serious enough to require garrisons, but not major concentrations of troops. That hierarchy of perceived threats reflected what German planners believed about geography and logistics, as much as what they thought they knew from intelligence. The Pas-de-Calais offered the shortest sea crossing, the best direct rail links to Germany, and strong existing Atlantic Wall fortifications. The fact that Allied deceptive signals pointed there merely confirmed German preconceptions. When the Allied armada approached Normandy before dawn on D-Day, the first German reactions were shaped by this mental framework. Initial reports of landings and airborne drops were alarming, but many officers still suspected that this might be only the opening act of a larger drama centered on Pas-de-Calais. When the Allied armada approached Normandy before dawn on D-Day, the first German reactions were shaped by this mental framework. Initial reports of landings and airborne drops were alarming, but many officers still suspected that this might be only the opening act of a larger drama centered on Pas-de-Calais. Because panzer reserves had been placed under Hitler's direct authority in earlier disputes between Rommel and von Rundstedt, his skepticism carried immediate operational consequences. At noon on that crucial day, he refused to release several armored divisions to counterattack the beaches, ordering them instead to remain poised to defend Pas-de-Calais. Only in the late afternoon did he grudgingly authorize the movement of 2 panzer divisions, Panzer Lehr and the 12th SS Panzer Division, and even then with strict instructions to advance mainly at night to avoid Allied air power. This decision stretched what might have been a swift armored counterstroke into a slow, vulnerable journey over several days. During those days, Allied forces dug in on the beaches, cleared obstacles, and pushed inland toward key towns like Caen and Carentan. Each additional hour without a massive coordinated German counterattack allowed more infantry, armor, artillery, and supplies to cross the beaches and strengthen the fragile foothold in Normandy. Historians have long debated whether a full-scale, early panzer counterattack could have driven the Allies back into the sea, but there is broad agreement that it would have made the battle far more costly and uncertain. The delay of roughly 3 days in committing major German armor, a delay rooted in belief in a phantom army across the Channel, shifted the odds of success significantly in the Allies' favor. Perhaps even more astonishing than those first critical days was the fact that the deception continued to work for weeks after D-Day. For roughly 7 weeks following the landings, German intelligence assessments and Hitler's directives continued to treat Pas-de-Calais as the likely site of a still pending main invasion. Reports from Garbo's network, reinforced by other controlled double agents, insisted that FUSAG remained in England and that its divisions had not yet been committed. According to this narrative, the Normandy landings were only one part of a broader Allied plan, not the decisive thrust, and therefore German forces in northern France had to hold back to meet the real blow. As late as mid-July of 1944, significant German forces, by some counts between 15 and 22 divisions, remained tied down in the Pas-de-Calais region. They were ordered to stay in position, conserving their strength for an invasion that Allied planners had never actually intended to launch. Only in early August, nearly 2 months after D-Day, did serious doubt begin to creep into the German analysis regarding FUSAG and the supposed second invasion. By then, the Allies had already broken out of Normandy in Operation Cobra, encircled German forces near Falaise, and begun racing across France towards the German border. During all of this time, Juan Pujol Garcia continued his double life as Garbo, feeding the Germans carefully measured truths and falsehoods that always pointed in the same deceptive direction. German intelligence valued his contributions so highly that they awarded him the Iron Cross for his services, unaware that British authorities had quietly honored him with the title of Member of the Order of the British Empire for exactly the same work. After the war, Pujol faded into anonymity, eventually settling in Latin America under a new identity, while his wartime role remained classified for decades. Only in the 1970s and later did historians and declassified documents bring to light the full extent of his contribution to Operation Fortitude and the Allied victory. Meanwhile, veterans of the Ghost Army returned home and resumed their peacetime careers, many without being able to tell even their families what they had really done in Europe. For years, their unit was just a curious entry in official records, its true mission hidden under layers of secrecy. When information about the Ghost Army and its missions finally became public through books, exhibitions, and documentaries, the sheer creativity of the unit captured the public's imagination. The idea that artists and designers armed with rubber tanks, paint, and sound recordings had helped turn the tide of war seemed almost incredible. Yet that was precisely what happened. In the decades since, military historians have tried to estimate how many lives were saved by Operation Fortitude and the web of deceptions that surrounded D-Day. While precise numbers are impossible, many assessments suggest that tens of thousands of Allied soldiers and perhaps similar numbers of Germans did not die in Normandy because critical divisions stayed pinned in Pas-de-Calais or Norway awaiting phantom threats. Beyond the arithmetic of casualties, Fortitude also shaped the post-war map of Europe by ensuring that Western Allied forces would liberate France and the Low Countries. Had the Normandy invasion failed or been much bloodier and slower, the Soviet Union might have advanced farther west before Germany collapsed, altering the political division of the continent for generations. One of the reasons Fortitude succeeded while other deceptions faltered was its multi-layered design, which blended human, technical, and physical elements into a coherent whole. No single piece of evidence, no one report, no single photograph, no isolated radio transmission, had to carry the entire burden of the lie. Instead, each element supported and confirmed the others. Another key factor was the Allies' ability to monitor German reactions in almost real time through ultra-intercepts, creating a rare closed feedback loop in intelligence work. If German analysts began to question some aspect of the narrative, planners could adjust their output, have double agents send clarifying details, or stage additional physical evidence to restore confidence. Crucially, the deception did not ask the Germans to believe something wildly implausible, but rather to lean into what already made sense to them. German doctrine and geography both suggested that the Pas-de-Calais was the most likely invasion site, so Fortitude's job was to amplify that expectation, rather than to plant an entirely new idea. In that sense, Operation Fortitude offers a timeless lesson about deception and propaganda. The most effective lie is one that makes your opponent feel wise and correct, not foolish. When people are led to believe that their prior assumptions have been confirmed by fresh intelligence, they cling to those beliefs even in the face of contradicting evidence. After nearly 30 years of secrecy, the declassification of Fortitude and Ghost Army materials allowed surviving participants to finally receive recognition. Exhibitions in museums, official commendations, and even moves in the United States Congress to honor the Ghost Army underscored how long overdue that acknowledgement was. Visitors today can walk through the wartime tunnels under Dover Castle, imagining the relentless tap of Morse keys and the murmur of radio operators sending messages for a phantom army. On the cliffs and fields of Kent and East Anglia, they can stand where inflatable tanks once fooled enemy cameras and where artists in uniform shaped the shadows of war. On the beaches and in the hedgerows of Normandy, memorials mark where real soldiers fought and died under the cover that deception had bought them. The quiet cemeteries and preserved bunkers carry a second, invisible history, that of the false armies and fabricated signals that helped reduce the number of graves that needed to be dug. In the final accounting, Operation Fortitude remains the clearest example of how information, imagination, and coordination can change the outcome of a vast industrial war. It shows that armies can be made of paper and rubber, as well as flesh and steel, and that the shadows cast on an enemy's mind can be as decisive as the forces arrayed on the ground. Juan Pujol Garcia, the Spanish farmer who never walked the streets he claimed to know so well, stands at the center of that story as a symbol of paradox. Decorated by both Hitler's regime and King George for the same acts of deception, he embodies the strange moral geometry of secret war, in which truth and falsehood are woven together to save lives by putting others in danger. Around him in that tapestry are figures like Duško Popov, the Serbian playboy often cited as an inspiration for the fictional James Bond, who provided independent-seeming confirmation of FUSAG to German handlers. There are the nameless radio operators, codebreakers, factory workers, truck drivers, and clerks whose small actions maintained the illusion day after day. There are also the very real German officers and analysts who, with all their training and experience, could not escape the well-constructed mirage before them. Their failure was not simply gullibility, but a reminder that in war, as in peace, even capable people can be misled when every piece of evidence they see appears to point in the same direction. The lesson of Fortitude is that wars are not won by force alone, nor by deception alone, but by a combination of both guided by deep understanding of the human mind. On that June morning in 1944, steel and courage carried men up the beaches of Normandy, but lies and illusions had already cleared part of the way for them. Long after the last inflatable tank was deflated, the last sound truck was parked, and the last Garbo message was sent, the ideas born in Fortitude have continued to echo. Military academies, Intelligence services and historians return to this operation as a case study in how creativity and rigorous planning can turn deception into a strategic weapon. In the end, the lesson of Fortitude is that wars are not won by force alone, nor by deception alone, but by a combination of both, guided by deep understanding of the human mind. On that June morning in 1944, steel and courage carried men up the beaches of Normandy, but lies and illusions had already cleared part of the way for them.